Hello, welcome to the second episode of our webinar series. This episode will focus on patient involvement in clinical trial protocol development, learnings from lung cancer research. My name is Karolina Werynska, and I'm a scientific program manager at the Rising Tide Foundation for Clinical Cancer Research, and it is my great pleasure to moderate today's webinar. This webinar series has been co-designed and co-developed by Rising Tide Foundation for Clinical Cancer Research and LUNGevity. Upal, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Karolina. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. It's been an immense privilege and honor to partner with Rising Tide Foundation for Clinical Cancer Research on this webinar series, which is specially looking at how patient partners and caregiver partners can co-create research protocols and design research in partnership with clinicians and researchers. And thank you again for joining us today. And I'm very grateful to the two panelists for giving us their time today. With that, Karolina, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. Indeed, our two foundations have decided to partner and co-create a series of webinars aiming to foster collaborations between patient and caregiver research advocates and researchers. This webinar series is designed to educate both patients and researchers on how to co-create different aspects of clinical trial design, provide examples of engagement tools and strategies that have worked well for successful patient-researcher partnerships, as well as discuss some metrics of such successful partnerships. I would like to invite you to watch our first episode of this webinar series, focusing on developing patient-centric clinical trial endpoints. And you can find this episode under this link. Today's webinar episode is targeted towards clinical researchers and patient or caregiver research advocates interested in co-creating clinical protocols. And we hope that this episode will help to promote patient involvement in developing an interventional therapeutic clinical trial protocol and give some real-world examples of patient involvement in protocol development. And now I'm honored to introduce our panelists today. The patient voice will be given by Janet Freeman-Daily. She is a cancer patient research advocate and co-founder of the Ross Wonders. Janet has also kindly moderated the first episode of our webinar. The clinical perspective will be given by Dr. Ross Camidge. He's a professor at medical oncology at the University of Colorado Cancer Center. Janet, Ross, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, likewise.
And I would like to open the webinar today with a question. What is an interventional clinical trial?
So this one's for me. So let's break down some of the words here. So a clinical trial is something that involves patients, and a trial is essentially asking a question that you hope the conduct of your trial will give you an answer. An interventional one means part of that question involves, does this therapy which I'm applying work? Does it work better than something else? Is it tolerated? So that I draw a distinction between that and, let's say, an observational clinical trial, which is like everybody's doing their normal thing and I'm asking how you're feeling, on a Tuesday. Do you want to go to the next? Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yes, there you go.
And I thought, when I was asked to come up with some ideas of where the patient voice is relevant in the design of clinical trials. So when you have a clinical trial, there's essentially a rule book that says you have to conduct it this way. You can't just sort of make it up on the fly. And so some of the things, for example, there are specific criteria called inclusion and exclusion criteria that you have to meet to say, okay, well, we want these kind of people, but not these kind of people to go into it. And that's the sort of thing where you can go through it if you're the patient advocate and sort of say, well, do you really need that? Do you really need your kidney function to be this good? Do you really need to have, had this treatment that we know doesn't work just to sort of check some kind of box? The other thing is for clinical trials that, particularly if they're treatment for somebody who's got advanced disease and their initial treatment, you've got to make it quick. You've got to make it easy to get into the study, because nobody wants to say, if I'm not in the study, I can start treatment tomorrow. But if I'm in the study, it's going to take me a month. So one thing is like, having to send a blood test all the way to some other city to get its result back because you don't trust the local lab. That seems silly. The other things are, excuse me, that many of the trials might have restrictions in terms of, okay, you've had to have had one treatment, but not two treatments, or two treatments, but not three. Sometimes that's important. I sometimes get people saying, well, I just want everybody to go into the trial. But remember, the function of the trial is to answer a question. And part of that is making sure that the right people go into the trial. So if you've had 57 lines of treatment and you know the treatment's not going to work, it's not about sort of doing you a favor and just getting you into the trial. So there have to be some criteria about lines of therapy, but I think that's a case-by-case discussion. The other thing is, we all know if you go in a clinical trial, you're kind of like a prize poodle. And so there's lots of fussing over you. Now, that can be good, but it can also be, what do you mean I have to come back tomorrow and the day after just so you can take a blood sample? And the treatment is given once every 3 weeks, but you want me to come back every week for the next 2 years. So thinking about the level of monitoring that is needed, whether remote monitoring can be done. I had a conversation with someone from the FDA the other day about they can measure levels of blood in a finger stick. So you're back home and you kind of prick your finger like it was a diabetes test, and you stick it on a piece of paper and they can mail that in. You don't have to have a blood sample taken. So there are lots of creative ways you can do it. On that same line, biopsies, we're in the world of personalized medicine. And so it's not unusual to say, I want to know exactly what's going on in your cancer before I start my intervention. If that's the case, do you can you use a fresh biopsy? Can you use the one that you had from last year? The other thing that's really funny is often trials say when the treatment stopped working, will you have another biopsy? And most people are kind of like, well, no, dude, I'm done with this. So, you look at that. Point 5, I know this is a bit of a laundry list, but point 5 I think is really important. This isn't the drug companies, this is regulatory authorities. And they have this tendency still to feel that overall survival, the time it takes for someone to live the rest of their life and die, to be blunt, is the gold standard. And I guess that's true. There's no equivocation. You're either alive or dead. But for some treatments, that is so far in the distance, making everything hold on to that seems silly to me. And also, if you've got a treatment that works, I don't want you to deny me the chance to get it if I went in a randomized study and got some standard of care later, because you want to isolate the survival effect. I'm sorry, I can't allow you to catch up later because you need to die first so I can get my data. And that's highly controversial because there's definitely a tension between the science and the regulatory affairs and what a patient and a physician want. Point 6 is toxicity reporting. This kind of touches into patient-centric endpoints. We tend to calculate something called the grade of toxicity. So there's a rule book that says, imagine whatever side effect you want: diarrhea, hair loss, your nose turning purple, whatever. And it's graded 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. The trouble is the way we capture that doesn't tell you the time it takes to occur, how long that peak toxicity lasts. And, somebody has written down that, this is the grade, but it's not all grade 2s and all grade 3s are the same. I think what users of this information really want is to know something much more pragmatic, like, can I go to work? Can I travel? Will I be able to eat in a restaurant? And so getting what's called patient-reported outcomes, or some changing the way we capture toxicity, I think is going to be in the future. Let's not forget that with all of these extra visits, especially if the trial site isn't in your backyard, you might have to travel, you might have to stay in hotels. So making sure that the clinical trials have got some kind of coverage for travel and accommodation. And then finally, something close to my heart is we now know for a lot of targeted therapies that you start on something, it works, and then when it stops working, it's not game over. Maybe it's working in 99% of places and just a little bit is growing. I think that should be captured in the trial. Okay, the time it took for the cancer to grow is this. But I also think they should allow you to think outside the box and zap that area with radiotherapy, especially if it's in the brain, and then, capture the information about keeping the drug going. And that's often in trials now, but, it's always good to just check it's there. If you go to the next slide, Karolina, I just want to give you an example of where patient involvement has either been good or bad, at least in my experience. So I think the bad experience is a group of investigators write a clinical trial and then they decide, oh, we need the patient voice. And then they sort of email it to Janet, like, we're going to submit this tomorrow. You okay? Just so I can say, look, we involved the patient voice. And then when, Janet comes back and says, but you can't do this, they go, well, that's just how we do it. You don't understand anything. And that to me is, a real opportunity missed. And especially if the academics are like, that's just how the way we do it. And you go, well, why? Why can't we change things? The other thing is, depending on where your protocol is going on, maybe it's international, if it's a randomized study and they say, if you go on the treatment, you get X, or you might get Y because I perceive Y as the standard of care. Well, maybe it's not the standard of care where I live. Maybe it's less than the standard of care. So these things I think are super important. And I think what the value is particularly not just like I'm a patient and here's my story, but I'm a patient, here's my story, and this is what I've heard from other people, and bring the idea to the clinicians who are trying to answer a question to say, yes, but this isn't the math problem. You're trying to answer a question that is being applied to human beings who have a family around them, friends around them, a life around them. And I'll probably stop at this point because we're talking about the patient voice, so let's get one.
Janet, would you like to say a few words from the patient perspective?
Karolina, yes, I would like to share some of the aspects of patient perspective that have come up when I've worked as a research advocate. One particular example was an NCI protocol where they were trying to gather data in the NCI, gosh, I'm blanking, just a second. In the NCI Cancer Moonshot Biobank protocol. They're trying to collect information and tissue from a very diverse set of patients who are all on targeted therapies so that they can see if targeted therapies have different effectiveness in different groups, which is fine, but they wanted to make sure they isolated the effects so that the person had only been on a targeted therapy. Therefore, in their eligibility criteria, they said no one who's had chemotherapy can be in this trial. Well, I know from many patients that their doctors will collect the biopsy and send it off for biomarker testing. And in the meantime, they put the patient on chemotherapy. That's a whole group of patients that they'd be eliminating from eligibility for this trial, just because in the community, that's kind of standard of care. So when I pointed that out to them, it was a surprise to the researchers. They're in an academic setting and they always wait to get their biomarker testing back unless it's an absolute emergency. So it never occurred to them that these people would have had chemotherapy, but they modified the protocol based on that feedback. I was really appreciative that they were willing to listen. So next slide.
Yes, I believe that now it's time for me to stop the slides and go into more dynamic conversation between the two of you. So maybe my first question would be, Janet, to you. How can a researcher that is just about to start drafting their clinical protocol and wants to engage patient partners in this process, how can they find such willing patient advocates?
Well, there's a variety of places that you can look for advocates. Your own institution may have an office of patient involvement or something by another name that you can contact to find out if they have available patients who understand protocols. You can reach out to the major patient advocate organizations such as LUNGevity, or the one that's appropriate for your particular type of cancer or disease, to find out if they have patient advocates available. There are often patient groups available on social media. You can look for people who are active on social media, posting on Twitter about their disease, people who have blogs that talk about the scientific aspects of their disease. So there's a variety of places you can look for patients. I will say that there are people who are patient advocates who are very good at sharing the patient's story, supporting other patients, providing education, but they might not be familiar with what clinical trials involve. So you may need to spend a little time educating your patient advocate about how a clinical trial works.
Ross, in your experience, is it easy to engage with patient partners in this protocol design phase? And if there are any hurdles that you have experienced, how did you overcome them?
I don't think everyone has established close relationships with their patients, especially if they're early in their career. Even if they haven't, and they sort of, I mean, if they're clinicians and they're seeing their own patients, the simplest thing is to put themselves mentally in that position. If they went from being the investigator to the patient tomorrow, would they do their own protocol? And that's a halfway house of saying, well, no, of course I'm not coming in every day. I'm trying to hold down a job. So I think that's a start. The other one is, I think the great thing about lung cancer is we do have these kind of long-term survivors and invested people. And the more you do it, the more you find these voices are sitting out there just waiting to be asked.
And Ross, when can a clinical protocol not be changed in your experience?
Well, usually after it's written and the protocol started. I mean, you can do what's called an amendment, but that can take some months. And then there are amendments where they have to literally hit the pause button and no one else can go on. So it can be quite disruptive. Or there are more minor amendments and it's sort of, you're fixing the car whilst it's moving forward. But there's I go back to the idea that the function of the clinical trial is to answer a question. And when you start to change the rules such that the question doesn't get answered, for example, I really want to know what the initial treatment effect is for somebody who's never had any other treatment. I can't include somebody who's had 6 lines of treatment because it's answering a different question.
And I think that perhaps is one of the barriers we run into is a lot of patient advocates don't understand the concept that a clinical trial is trying to answer a specific scientific question. They think a clinical trial is to offer them a treatment option. So they tend to want to make suggestions that make it easy for the patient to get access to the drug, but sometimes those things interfere with answering the research question. And that's when the researcher needs to be able to help them understand what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, and sometimes it makes sense. It's kind of like, okay, I think this drug might cause some terrible side effect, and therefore people who are more prone to this side effect, I don't want to put them in the trial. It might be dangerous for them. But at the same time, because a lot of clinical trials are written through cut and paste, I took the template I had last time. Maybe they're bringing over a whole baggage of things that exclude people that they don't need to. So I think you have to question everyone when you start the trial. But if it's already established, it's much harder to sort of say, well, can you tweak it just so I can get in?
A question to Janet. How do you handle a situation where a researcher is unable to incorporate your feedback in their protocol?
Well, sometimes it can be quite frustrating, but I've, at least for myself, tried to realize that sometimes it takes a while to educate a researcher about the value of hearing the feedback. Sometimes a person has constraints imposed on them that I'm not aware of, I try and ask what those constraints are, but you don't always win, and you have to sometimes be willing to allow that what you want is not going to happen.
Yeah, you can't win every battle, but you don't
That's
give
true.
up just because you didn't win.
Right.
It's a give and take, I see. Ross, you mentioned local ablative therapy in your speech. What are your thoughts about allowing local ablative therapy in phase 1 trials, especially patients who develop oligometastatic disease while on the protocol?
Yeah, no, in fact, that's where we first described it. So the first time we really jumped into it was in the phase 1 study of crizotinib, which was being developed as an ALK inhibitor at the time. And you see these people that progress, and unlike progression on chemotherapy, where like everything was not growing and then everything was growing, like most of the sites of the disease that somebody started with would still be being suppressed, and like one deposit in an adrenal gland or a bone deposit would grow. We now understand that's because there's sort of clonal evolution in the cancer. And because it was actually much easier in a phase 1 study because, it didn't have gazillions of dollars riding on it. And so we were able to get the company, which was Pfizer at the time, to just allow us to do it. And I think they didn't even do an amendment. They just did what they called a note to file, which is a sort of clarification saying, the protocol is silent on this, but we're going to say it's okay. We'll capture the time to that first progression. And now, we've got all our data for our regulatory purposes. After that, you can do what you like. You think it makes sense, go for it.
Thank you. Our question to both of you, Janet and Ross. What happens if a trial is not accruing and then the researchers realizes that the protocol needs some tweaking, some fixing, because it actually doesn't align with patient reality?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that is kind of reality coming calling, so the stubborn investigator who goes, Janet, you're not a doctor. You don't know what you're talking about. Of course, they're going to come in 7 times a day and then 3 o'clock in the morning. And then they realize it doesn't happen. So yeah, then they have to either walk away from their protocol, which would be really sad, or, they have to amend it. And that's really where Janet has to avoid going, I told you so, and go, yes, I would love to help you to amend it.
Yes. And along those same lines, it's very helpful if the researchers open to some discussions early on. Some of these trials, people have been on it for a long time. I was on one of the trials for 8 years or something. When you're on a trial that long, after a while, you don't want to come in every 2 months for getting your scans. Maybe you can make some adjustments for people who've been on your trial protocol for a long period of time. And I'm not sure, Ross, does that go into the protocol, or is that a decision made by the individual investigator?
No, I love that. But I mean, it's funny because when you write the protocol, you don't know if your thing's going to work, especially if it's an early phase study. And so, yes, some people are surprised by success, and crizotinib would be a great example of that. And the protocol, isn't written out for what do you do after 8 years, because they weren't expecting it. What you do is you then amend the protocol, and you sort of go, yeah, look, I'm not going to do an 8-year follow up on this study. I'm going to make it a bit more flexible. That's what you should do.
What would be your advice in terms of timeline? A inexperienced clinician who is just about to start drafting protocol and has never worked with patient partner before, what sort of time space are we talking about here?
You mean time working with the advocate?
Exactly before the application deadline. What time frame they should plan?
Well, ideally, they should bring the patient in from the beginning to say, I'm thinking of doing a trial like this. Is this kind of research question of interest to patient advocates? Would patients want to join a trial like this? I mean, I've seen trials where they take 2 drugs, neither of which have any preclinical data, and they say, let's try this combination and see if it works. And boy, I'm not interested in being on a trial that has absolutely no indication of whether or not it's going to be beneficial.
Yeah, usually it's because both drugs are made by the same drug company. Look, we open the cupboard. We have cornflakes and treacle. Let's have that for dinner.
You're going to have to explain your terminology. I don't even know that reference.
Oh, treacle is, sorry, that's like golden. Hold on, what do you call that? Corn syrup. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I think it's somewhat taken from Alice in Wonderland, but there we go.
Fair enough.
Oh, there,
Well,
Upel loves treacle pudding.
Well, I think that I can remember one meeting we were at where they were showing the preliminary results of a phase 1 trial. And I was sitting next to another patient who was on their 3rd line of treatment. So we're both looking at this. And they're showing these 2 drugs, and 90% of patients in the trial had grade 3 side effects. And we're looking at each other saying, I'm not going to take that drug. Are you going to take that drug? And I realize you can't know what the side effects are ahead of time, but there should have been at least some preclinical testing to find out if that combination was tolerable. And I think researchers don't always think of that.
Well, there is a tendency when you're a young investigator to say, I've got to think of a trial. They've told me I've got to write a trial. And usually it's kind of like, well, we've got A and we've got B. Let's try A and B. But like you say, that's kind of the paradigm of 20, 30 years ago, which wasn't wildly successful.
And what would be your advice this is a question to both of you, Janet and Ross. What is the appropriate number of patient partners to engage with in a co-designing of clinical protocol?
I'm not sure that there's a large number of patient partners out there to be able to get them involved. So I'd be happy if every trial had at least one patient advocate.
Yeah, one is better than none. But let's imagine a scenario where the patient or caregiver advocate is like salt. It has to be in every recipe. And there are going to be people who have different views. And there are, variably skilled advocates who can put their personal story apart from the task in hand. And there are those who can't. And so it's, in an ideal world, yeah, maybe you get, more than one. And again, it depends on the details of your study and what you're looking for. But yeah, but one is better than none.
I'm actually on one community advisory board at a major cancer center where we have 8 patient advocates, all from different cancers, and they can provide feedback on more than one trial. It may not be your type of cancer. It might be, somebody else's, but I've been amazed at the variety of inputs that we get. And not everybody thinks of the same things. Some people's opinion is different than mine, which is fine. But I think it's really helpful for the researcher to get that feel from the patients that there is a variety of perspectives and there's a variety of concerns out there.
Do you know what I'd love to see? This is going off topic a bit, Karolina, but what I'd really like to see is all investigators, when they first start their new job, is they spend a day pretending to be a trial patient. And you drag them around and you take a blood sample and you put them in a sham CT and you put them in an MRI and you say, well, you got to sit there for, 60 minutes and we'll play rock music at you. And you go, just so they know what it goes through. Oh,
and it includes the, I'm sorry, we had a scheduling snafu. You have to wait 2 hours for your scan.
Exactly. It turns into that Star Trek episode with, with the game where they're all supposed to lose, just so they can experience, loss.
Kobayashi Maru.
Yes, this is total nerd reference. Yeah.
Love it. Janet, do you have a good example of a partnership that you could describe here?
There's a really good example of a partnership that's come up in the past year called the Lung Cancer Genetics Study. It started as an idea by a company, 23andMe, that had the capability of doing genetics research. But rather than designing the study and then trying to get people recruited to it, they reached out to a variety of patient groups and the major lung cancer advocacy organizations and brought us all in from the beginning and said, we'd like to do a study like this. What do you think? They got a lot of feedback. They made some major changes to their protocol. Initially, they thought they were going to be able to get tissue from every patient that came into the program, and we helped them understand that wasn't going to happen. But as a result, we now have a study that is hopefully going to collect thousands of patients' data related to their genome to find out if that plays a role in their lung cancer. And all of the patients groups are helping to get the word out there, and they're providing support for it. And it's really amazing for it to feel like the first community-wide effort in lung cancer to put a study together. I would love to see more projects work with the patients from the very outset. They'll end up with a study that people want to see the results.
Very impressive. Thank you for sharing that, Janet. Ross, I have a question to you. You mentioned that overall survival is a endpoint, but what, in your opinion, what is a good patient-centric endpoint for intervention clinical trial?
So this is controversial. This goes back to the day of chemotherapy, where you could give something fairly toxic and the cancer would shrink. And maybe, it took longer for the cancer to grow, but there was a perception that, was this more pain than gain? And so people were very skeptical that, if the patient didn't live longer, this was just nonsense. If the patient shrank as much as the tumor did, it wasn't a win. And that philosophical thinking has lingered even when we get into the world of targeted therapies. And so you have, even with the initial EGFR inhibitors, where you could have, progression-free survivals of a year and a half, whatever, people are still saying, but you haven't proven there's an overall survival benefit. And you kind of go, well, okay, so if you don't get whatever that treatment is and you can get it later and that kind of lifts you up, you can play catch up later. And so you don't see an overall survival difference because everybody's living longer. And it doesn't mean it's a failure. It's only a failure if you take it away. And unfortunately, that's how some regulatory authorities, particularly in Europe, have continued to view these things, like no overall survival benefit. I can't tell you that this huge PFS advantage is actually useful. And it's blatantly wrong. So if I try and draw an analogy, so it's like showing that what you had for breakfast today influences your longevity in 40 years' time. And because you can't show that, it doesn't mean you shouldn't eat. And unfortunately, that's the way the logic is still working on. So I think response rate, progression-free survival, duration of response, they are all important in the context of knowing the toxicity such that you're not losing something with this. I think the concept that you've got an obvious short-term win and somehow, the mystic gods take it away from you later through karma and then don't affect your overall survival is probably wrong. But that still contaminates the overall survival thinking. And it's the regulatory authorities who are pushing for this, not the drug companies.
Well, and I think also from the patient perspective, progression-free survival is something that matters to us. It's one thing to know that you're living with, in the case of metastatic lung cancer, an incurable disease that will probably kill you. But to know that you have the possibility with this drug of having 3 or 4 good years without having to deal with cancer is huge. And just because you might die right after that, we still had that time to live. So a lot of regulators want to say progression-free survival isn't that important. Well, it sure is important to the patients.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, one area where that really changed my thinking was in the adjuvant study. So somebody has surgery and then they go on a targeted therapy for a period of time, and they calculate what's called the disease-free survival, because surgery's done and technically there's no disease there, and if it comes back, how long does it take to come back? And there was a concern, in fact, there's still a concern, that the targeted therapy given for a defined period of time stops is just delaying the inevitable. You're just kicking the can down the road. And so initially that was one of the real holdouts that sort of said overall survival is what's going to matter. And yet, if you listen to patients in that position and you go, well, you've just heard that you've got cancer and your world is in a mess. And I say, look, I don't know what's going to happen if the cancer is going to come back or not, but it's just not going to be an issue for the next 3 years if you go on this pill. They're like, sign me up.
So one of the issues that I've had pharma consult with me on several times, pharmaceutical companies, is it worth trying to pursue this clinical trial for a new first-line treatment, given there's already an approved drug out there? And I know sometimes it's difficult to try and accrue to a trial that's a first-line drug when the patient says, why should I have to go through the pain of a clinical trial and all of these regulated scans when I can just take something and not worry about it? And I think that's a discussion that more PIs need to have with patient advocates. If there's a drug that's available, but it's got significant side effects, or there's a drug that's available and it doesn't work very well, then there's going to be more interest in a clinical trial for a first-line drug than if there's a drug that works out there and people don't see any issues for 6 years. And I think that also creates some challenges for the physicians like Ross that have to convince people that a clinical trial might be a good option. So I was wondering what you thought about that, Ross.
Yeah, well, so there's two things. So there are clinical trials that I mean, clinical trials cross my desk multiple times a week, and some I won't take on because I think I wouldn't do that. I think the classic example is these randomized studies where what they're randomizing you to is clearly going to be toxic or really inconvenient. And so even if there is a benefit, you're giving with one hand, taking away with the other. Or the other one is that the control arm is different from what I would normally do. And so one of the questions I try and teach people to ask if they're offered a randomized study is to say, doctor, if I wasn't in this study, what would you be doing? And if that's different from what's in the control arm, there's an issue. But how do you get people on first line studies? So you try and choose ones where there really is equipoise in the mind of the physician, in the mind of the person going through it, in terms of the inconvenience, and assuming that you believe in the question that's being asked and how it's being asked, then it comes down to appropriately communicating the benefits to the person and to the community. And sometimes I'm a good salesman and sometimes I'm not.
Ross, as a question to you, if you are an investigator engaging with patient partners for the first time, do you know of any resources available that will help to guide you in this process?
I don't, other than what we're producing now. But Janet, you had some ideas?
So the AACR has a workshop where they bring young investigators together with patient advocates and others to learn how to write clinical protocols. I believe it's called the AACR ASCO Methods in Clinical Cancer Research Workshop. It used to be called the Vail Workshop because it was held in Vail, Colorado, but this year it was in San Diego, California. So that is a really great experience to learn how patient advocates can help contribute to writing the protocol, as well as learning how to write an effective protocol.
Yeah, I think even just separate from a kind of intensive workshop like that is if you think it's important to learn to ask the right question and how to answer it in a clinical trial, one of those questions is how do you make the clinical trial palatable and acceptable to the human beings who you're proposing, give up their time and energy to be involved in it.
Thank you both very much. I will share the final slide with take-home message. Janet, Ross, what do you think would be the key points to remember after listening to this webinar? Ross, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about recognizing that, you're a brilliant young investigator and you want to answer a really interesting question, but it's got to be feasible to answer it. And some of that is about, the resources you have, but some of those resources are the patient voice and the caregiver voice telling you whether an autonomous individual is going to actually say, yes, I am going to sign up for your protocol. And that's where getting the involvement of these stakeholders early is key.
Thank you. Janet?
I agree. Getting the involvement of the patient and caregiver advocates from the outset can make a huge difference in your project. And it can help ensure that your particular protocol is aligned with the patient's reality to make it easier for them to find your trial and get enrolled.
Perfect. Well, it's been my pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you to everyone who was listening. And yes, stay tuned for episode 3 of our webinars. Thank you and have a good day. Bye-bye.